So hello again, and welcome to the book launch of Working Out, a brand new poetry collection written by David Hughes and published by Parthian Books. Thank you so much to everyone for being here, first of all. But just before we get started, I'd like to remind everyone that this event is proudly in association with Cover to Cover, Swansea's only independent bookshop. You can purchase David's collection on the Cover to Cover website, which is linked in the description below, and I'll put the link in the chat later for you all to access if you want to. And please feel free to use the chat function yourselves throughout the event, which I believe is located on the right-hand side of your screen, or perhaps just below it for some people. And any questions you have about the book, David will be answering during the launch, and it'd be great for you all to get involved so we can make it as interactive as possible considering the circumstances. But anyway, that is enough from me. I'll now hand over to Dr. Alan Kellerman, the editor of Working Out, who will be in conversation with Swansea poetry legend David Hughes about his captivating new collection.
Brilliant. Thanks, Holly. Right, I'm just waiting for Dave to see Dave on the screen, hopefully with me. But yes, I'd like to just thank Holly in the first instance, and thank you all for being here for this launch. It's, I know it's very, very important to Dave that he was able to put the book out there, and I'd also like to, to thank Holly as well for the choice of format. This is I think, is an excellent platform, and it certainly looks to me a lot more professional than some of the ones than using Zoom again. It's much more fit for purpose, and I think it's going to look really good. But it's been my pleasure to edit Dave's work. I've enjoyed seeing the poems again and again, and in their in each of their iterations, really. So I'm really thrilled to be able to ask Dave a few questions today, to hear what he has to say, to gauge his responses. What I'd also encourage you to do is, as Holly mentioned, if you do have any questions or you do have any comments, please just pop them in, and we'll put them on the screen so everybody can see. We want this to be a very, very fluid, interactive event. I don't think we didn't envisage a sort of a one set of questions and then questions at the end. So please, if you've got questions, pop them up as they go, and we'll try to manage them as we do the question and answer. So without further ado, I'd like to bring our star on tonight, Dave Hughes. And I believe he's going to begin by with a few things. He's going to also read the title poem from the collection. But really, I'd rather you hear it from him. So please welcome Dave Hughes, and please, as we said, if you have any questions or anything, do feel free to sort of send us a comment. Dave?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks very much. I wanted to say hello to everybody. I'm assuming there are people out there. I've been promised there are people out there, so hello to all of you. And I'd like to just to say some thank yous at this stage, particularly to all at Parthian, and to Holly, who's been mentioned, whose technological expertise is making this event possible. To Emily Cordell, who designed the cover of Working Out. But I'm very taken with it, very pleased she came up with that. To Elaine Sharples, who did the typesetting. And to Susie Wildsmith for coordination of the various stages and processes leading to publication, and particularly to Alan for the terrific editing work that he did. I'd also like to thank John Gower and Rhys Owain Williams for their kind and generous comments on my collection. I'm delighted that Tim Batcup of Cover to Cover in Mumbles is involved in this launch. An independent bookshop is something for us all to treasure, and he's stocking Working Out. And finally, my eternal gratitude to Gwyneth for so much support and encouragement over the years, and for not letting Johnny Cash to come between us. See page 65 of the book. I'd just like then to kick off with reading the title poem. About 4 or 5 years ago, Gwyneth persuaded me to join her on trips to Penland Gym. And I did sort of enjoy it. But one of the benefits of COVID has meant that I don't have to go anymore. Well, not at the moment anyway. So this is working out. A high ceiling and high windows make him think of factories. Banner slogans urge a greater effort, and music thumps a working beat. Machines line the walls with levers, belts, and handles. Screens scanned, checked, reset. He comes each week to loosen his limbs, lose some weight, make the heartbeat stronger, longer. Youngsters in their tight, bright kit flex and strut. Tattoos tremble across tanned skin. Lycra clings to buttock and thigh. A pliant mould where muscles swell and roll. He wears flappy grey. He rides the bike, strides the treadmill. He hauls, heaves, sweats and grunts. He nudges back that finishing line. A glimpse in the mirror, a little vanity allowed. Not too bad, he thinks, for his 70th year. Targets have been hit. Boxes can be ticked. He's put in a good shift. It's time to show his card. The one in black smiles, consults his book, suggests a new deadline. Thanks.
Excellent. I think it's hard not to applaud in some of these situations after each reading, but I think we'll have to, such are the times. We'll have to manage. The first thing that strikes me, Dave, I've seen this perhaps almost as often as you have, and the first thing it makes me wonder about is sort of writing practice and writing habit. Is this something that's similarly, metaphorical for writing as well? Is there are there parallels between this idea of working out, on the page as well as working out physically?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I did like the obvious pun of working out and the contemporary usage of that phrase. But I do like the fact that it's an obvious pun for a puzzle. And of course, there is that element in poetry of the puzzle, something which is enigmatic, something that has to be worked at and got through, hopefully. But yes, I think there is an element of that. I think there is clearly, I believe, that you've just got to work at things for quite a long time to become fit and healthy in a poetic sense as well. So yes, I do find that when I am writing, I spend a long time at it.
Okay, certainly, yeah. It's always good to hear, and it's something I think that a lot of people don't always get a chance to acknowledge, because when a collection comes out, we very rarely see the effort that goes into it. When somebody has the same way if somebody has a very chiseled physique, we very rarely see the effort that they put in getting it that way. We look at that person, we think, oh my God, look at all those muscles. Didn't know the human body had that many, the same way with poetry, I suppose. It's interesting that you mentioned the word puzzle, and I really like that. Is that a way that you do genuinely look at your poems, or is it something slightly different? Do you puzzle out your poems, or is there a better way, a more interesting way of putting that?
I think I came across a quote by Robert Frost that I hadn't heard before the other day, which was, he said he wrote poetry to find out what he didn't know. And I suddenly thought, well, that suddenly resonated with me, because I think what often happens is, and you will know because you write yourself, Al, that you can start work on something. You think you're starting to work on something and it turns into something else. and very often you don't seem to have much control over that. But in the process of working at one thing, something else emerges. So I think in that sense, poetry has that puzzle element, but also I think then for the reader, and very often what is quite, I quite enjoy the fact that people will say things to me about a poem which I will not have thought of, I will not have detected. And it's a perfectly legitimate and valid point that they're making or observing. So in that sense as well, I think that, that there is an element of the puzzle to writing.
Okay. Fair enough. Yeah, absolutely. In terms of that, I want to shift gears a little bit, but only just a little bit. Still staying on the idea of writing. It's always, I know it's a simple question, but I think it's often a really, really valid and interesting one. To know where writers get their ideas. Obviously we can look through the collection, we can see, some pretty clear examples of where you've gotten your ideas, but others maybe not so much. Do you find that, and I'm going to try my best not to put this in terms of a dichotomy because I can't stand a dichotomy. Things are more nuanced than that usually. And I think that's actually one of the benefits of this collection, is that there's an incredible amount of nuance in the things that you're presenting. But at the same time, do you find you go out hunting for your ideas? Do you find they come to you? Do you find they're, or is it some sort of mix of those, or is it something entirely different? But how do you find or capture the things that you want to write about?
Yes, interesting. I think I use my notebooks a lot, because again, sort of harking back to what I've just been saying, I think you jot things down in your notebook that you observe or overhear, or just a few words come to you, and nothing much happens at the time. Then you go back, and they will perhaps trigger some new idea later on. So for me, there's an element of jotting things down as I think of them, and an awful lot of them have not become poems, but a lot of them I hope will become poems someday. I will go back to them. So I'm yeah, I guess the ideas are as I say, are jotted down, and that's what I found quite interesting about the course, was that we were asked to do specific things in a way that I hadn't generated them. We were asked by our tutors to come up with something in relation to blah blah blah, and I found that quite an interesting experience. And why not? Why not be set a specific title or idea to work with? But generally speaking, obviously, it's a solitary activity, so you're coming up with your own ideas. Yeah.
Okay. Here we are. Kate Potter asking, do ideas come to you when you're walking? Does that happen to you?
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Very much so. Very much so. I think that probably over the last couple of years, certainly when I've been doing more walking, I certainly observed things and noted things that I would like to either use as part of poems, or as potentially poems in their own rights, but can become poems in their own rights. I don't do what I remember Nigel Jenkins telling me when he found difficulty with a particular poem. He would go out on a long walk and use that to work his way through. Maybe the rhythm of walking would help him, but it was I can't do that I cannot do that. I find that I'm distracted much too easily. But in terms of ideas, certainly when I'm out walking, yeah.
So I wonder, out of curiosity, I have to ask this, only because I've talked to a lot of people who find the same thing. On trains, do you ever find yourself writing on trains, or having good luck writing on trains? Or
No,
no?
hopeless. That would be. I'd be too distracted. I really would,
Fair
and
enough.
I'm probably listening to other people's conversations anyway.
Fair enough. No, I just thought, because Kate asked about walking, I thought I better get one in there as well and ask about
Yeah,
trains.
yeah. No, I
You know,
couldn't.
I
No,
suppose it's different for each person. As you said, Nigel found, worked out his thing, his problems while walking. I mean, I don't know that I could do that. Each one of us has his or her own different way of going about things.
yeah.
I'm going to jump back a little, just because you mentioned the MA course that you did at Swansea University, and bring in the work that you did there, because of course some of it made it into the collection, and I think it's at the risk of having a slightly ham-handed segue into it. Is there a poem you particularly were fond of that you wrote on the course? Maybe it changed completely afterwards or something like that. But was there something you felt like? Was there a particular poem that stood out to you that you wrote while you were studying?
No, not one in particular, but there are a couple of pieces that were technically more challenging. I'd never ever written a sestina, and I was I was pleased with that, because again I felt it turned into something more than I thought it would. But I technically, again, there was the challenge you set about the a sonnet with the instead of putting the rhyme at the end, putting a rhyme, or in my case a half rhyme, in the middle of each line. So I thought I'm never going to be able to do this, but it actually turned out to be something I was quite pleased about, which was the mature student poem. So, well, shall I read that now?
Yeah, please. I was just going to suggest that, as a matter of fact. Yeah, that would be grand.
Right. So, yes, as Al was saying, I did this course a couple of years ago, and in a way, it was I decided to do it part-time, which was great because it stretched over 2 years and more. So I think I got more out of it that way. But living in the uplands, it's close to the university campus, and I used to really enjoy the walk, because you walk through two parks in effect, to Bryn Mill and Singleton, to get to the university campus. And I was struck by the flow of the students who were going on the same journey as me. Right, mature student. And this is on page 11, if people are following, want to follow. The steady stream comes down through Upland Square, gathering momentum from Swansea's hills. In Gwyder Crescent, where he joins the slew of students as they mill through terraced leats, they become a river, young and flowing. He is older, awkward and less sure, yet pressed to follow in the race. Now together they pour into the park. Others join from north and east to squeeze through gates and sweep past trees. The river moves west, a swelling force. He flounders, gasps, he's out of his depth. But the youthful spate will carry him on. It's uplifting and strong, will keep him afloat.
Excellent. Thanks for that. Yeah. I remember reading that, and it it's quite a striking effort, and it was not an easy task that I had set
No,
either.
it's not.
I don't know that I'm necessarily that mean a taskmaster, but I kind of felt like it after I'd given people that. So the good news is that you've gotten something quite productive out of it, and that's really it's always good to see. Is when a task comes to fruition. I've got two questions here in the comments, and we'll get to each of those in turn. The first was Derek's come up a moment ago, and he was asking about the third person point of view in working out. And he asks, do you feel happier in the observer mode rather than using the first person in that poem?
Oh, good question, Derek. Actually, there are times when I'm sure lots of people do this when they write. It helps to write something in a different person because you can become the observer, and in that instance, I'm actually looking at myself or imagining how I might appear, which I think I probably wrote the initial versions were in the first person. But as I went on, I think it was more useful to change it to the third person. And I think it's better for that. And in fact, I did that with mature student. With others, I haven't done that, but I think it is quite useful to distance yourself via the third person.
Absolutely, and I'm going to jump to the next one as well. If my Welsh holds, this is from your granddaughter. It sounds like. Which is your favorite poem in the book and why? Now that is a very difficult question for any poet, I think.
Oh, and it's come from my granddaughter.
Yes.
Right. Well, Branwen, that is a very, very difficult question to answer. I think quite possibly the one about my grandfather, which I'll be reading at the end. I think because of my relationship with him, and I hope there are a couple of other people who are here tonight who will remember him as well. He was such a strong character, and I'd already written one or two poems about him before, but I wanted to write something else as well, and I think it's that one, the one at the end, which is called Cultivation, and it's about the way he always used to smell of the rosemary bush. But I read it at the end.
Excellent. Yeah, it's one of my favorites as well, and for very similar reasons too. I've got to say, it was one of the ones that struck me. When I'd read the manuscript in the first instance, was that one particularly, the tenderness, the accuracy. It reminded me a bit of Rethke. It reminded me a bit of Seamus Heaney in the way men were portrayed in poems. But also, it kind of forged its own path. There was an acknowledgement of the masculinity of an individual, the projected masculinity maybe. But there was also peculiar tenderness in that poem. And that's not the only poem that in which that happens. There's a couple of oddly enough, the other two that spring immediately to mind both involve men dancing. Yes. Which is not usually the sort of, when you're going to write about men, this is the activity you write about. You might write about, digging or working in the field, or, going down the mine, or in the US, it was, on the production line or something like that, So you had these very work personly attributes. I very much like that you had that facet to your work. Is that something that, I know we've talked about this before, so to ask you if it's a conscious thing or not, we've covered that already, and you seem to think that it, you hadn't really realized it. Do you know where it might have come from, now that you've had a bit of a chance to think about it, or, is that something that still sort of eludes you at this point?
Yeah, it is really interesting. No, I have come to not an absolute conclusion about it, but I think it has a lot to do with my father and my grandfather, who was my mother's father, and my grandfather lived in the home with us. So there were these two very, very different men in the house all the time when I was growing up. My father, an Anglican clergyman who loved poetry, music, um, but was very a little bit uh, well, very imaginative and rather a bit of a dreamer. Whereas my grandfather believed very much in hard work and having absolute focus. But then my dad, with all this dreaming interest in the arts, loved rugby and boxing. And conversely, my grandfather, for all his quite rigid approach to work, loved singing, he carved spoons, and he had this other side to him. So I had these two men as I was growing up with really different ways of living in the world. So I suppose I saw it at first hand, and I hadn't consciously. You pointed out to me that I do this in a number of these poems, and I hadn't thought about it.
It seems very, very beneficial, and I like and maybe it is just that environment as well. You know, growing up in a place where where your pursuits were accepted as something you could be interested in anything that you like. Being interested in poetry didn't preclude you from being interested in rugby, or working hard didn't preclude you from being interested in art or something like that.
No, quite.
I'm going to jump down to, because Kate asked, could you please read one of the Townhill Welsh poems, perhaps like Rome, like? And I think that would be great if we started with one of those. Maybe then we could find our way into talking about a few other things from that. So up to you whether you want to take
Okay.
Find you out.
Okay, righto. Yes, several years ago, I started to write some Swansea dialect poems, and I still like to do so. And not all of them are humorous, but this one is meant to be. And it's called Like Rome Like. I heard some clever sod said Swansea was like Rome, 'cause it's built on 7 hills. Well, I've been counting them up like. First off is Town Hill, where the weather's always different. And there's May Hill, round the side, and if you carry on, you get to Green Hill. Green, 'cause of all the Irish who come there years ago. Well, that's what my old man reckons anyway. Ravenhill's on your way to Bliney Mice, but I never seen no ravens up there. Few jackdaws and magpies, but no ravens. Rose Hill's up behind Uplands, where is a quarry by Terrace Road. From here is close to Constitution Hill. Now that's the sort of hill you wouldn't want to climb drunk or sober. And over east side is Kilvey Hill, what everyone goes round when they can't tell you something straight. That's 7 hills, all right. But then there's Welsh ones, 'cause Bryn means hill, and so does Pen. Bryn Yfryd and Bryn Mill, Penvillier and Penlan. And then Mount Pleasant's got to be an hill with a name like that. That's 12, and I bet I missed some out. That fella might have been good at geography, but he couldn't count.
That's one of the first things I actually remember about your work, not from this particularly, but from Tidy Boy, is actually the poem Tidy Boy, oddly enough. Just hearing that voice that, when I came to Swansea, how many years ago was it? 15 years ago, something like that now. I mean, my ears improved a little, but, the fact that it was as if the what I was hearing was transplanted into one of those poems. So I mean, the accuracy as far as my American tenure goes is pretty astounding. But is there anything that kicked you off on that track? Is there anything that sort of started you writing in dialect, or first gave you that impetus?
Yes, very specifically. 30 years ago, 36 years ago, I think, when I did a poetry workshop with Nigel Jenkins. He introduced the group to the poetry of Tom Leonard, Glasgow poet. And I was completely bowled over by Tom Leonard's poetry, because he was writing everything in Glasgow dialect. And he was writing about really serious stuff. This wasn't jokey, let's laugh at these people with funny accents. It was really powerful stuff. And he did write, he's written some funny stuff as well. But I was quite taken with that. And Nigel showed us his poem, which is a sort of gentle takeoff of the William Carlos Williams "This Is Just to Let You Know," about the plums in the icebox, and or is it peaches, plums? And I did a version. Tom Leonard did a version about 3 bottles of heavy which had been left in the fridge, and I did a version which was about a pasty that had been left in the oven, in Swansea speak. So that was the very modest and rather silly start. But after that, I got really interested in it. Yeah.
Believe it or not, those particular pieces were introduced to us as MA students as well. So we got that dialect flavor, Because I mean, coming in as poetry students, most people are familiar with William Carlos Williams. It's a short enough poem to make the point. So we got, without knowing that I'd be sitting here today, of course, my education started very early in that. I think it's really interesting that you've sort of taken this on, and that it's become a part of your a part of your sort of oeuvre. Really, is this the Swansea dialect poet. I mean, obviously not to sort of pigeonhole or limit what you're doing, obviously, because there's a lot more in the collection than just that. But it seems a very peculiar ability of yours to capture accurately, and I think that's an important thing to note is how accurately you capture things. You're not judging in the proper sort of Chekhovian way. We don't judge our characters. We simply record, we report, and we pass that along. Is that sort of that attitude? Is that something that you're very careful to preserve, or is it something that you feel you do naturally or normally in your poems?
I think it's quite. I always feel I'm on quite difficult ground with it, because I know I don't speak like that on a day-to-day basis. But the truth of the matter is, we all run our words together. We all chop bits off the ends and, shorten the beginnings or whatever. So I think what I am really interested in the way, particularly some of the turns of phrases, which are really, really very entertaining in their own right. But I think again, harking back to Tom Leonard, he's got a poem about reading the 6 o'clock news, and he writes it all in Glasgow dialect, and he ends up by saying, this is my news. You read it in your posh BBC London accent, but I'm telling you my news. And I think in a way, it's a bit perhaps presumptuous and perhaps pretentious of me, but I do feel a kind of I think it's important to remember that that people have different ways of expressing themselves, and there are no right and wrong ways people express themselves. Yeah.
Oh, there we go. Certainly.
Yeah.
And I think, I mean, there's, we encourage, and and perhaps it's do a look at it as well in this context. But we do encourage writers to listen and listen carefully and closely, and perhaps it's that that the more sort of accurately we portray our fellows, the more that's respected. Maybe, I don't know. If we can be sensitive with it, and all of the portrayals in there are nothing less than sensitive. So, or at least I've found the beauty of them is that as you say, they do sometimes take on something that is quite humorous, but at the same time, there's the lovely sort of shift between or I should say juxtaposition between the sort of the dialect and the actual sometimes tragic nature of what's actually being dealt with in the poem. I think is really poignant, and I think that works well. Is that something you've stepped out and deliberately decided, or have you just has this presented itself as a
it was a little bit of a conscious reaction to whenever local accents, they're invariably presented in a jokey way. Well, not invariably, but a lot of the time, they're for a cheap laugh. And I think I thought, well, I wanted to write about more serious things, but in the accent. And funnily enough, I did a reading many years ago in Geneva School. Peter and Judith, if you're out there, and I read some of my poems, and the kids were really engaged, and I really enjoyed it. But one of the girls came up to me after, and she said, "Why are all your poems so miserable?" So I did think, well, I've been caught out here. So I do try and mix them up a bit.
Yeah. So I'm just bouncing back and forth on and off here. It now seems to be less sensitive than it used to be. Just to switch gears a little bit, because I kind of want to try to bring us back onto a path that might lead us to another poem in this context. But things like we mentioned early on with working out and puzzling things out, editing and rewriting, and we mentioned how how important it was to sort of to in the development of a poem to work on a poem and to put effort in. And there's one particular, I mean, I don't know that you need to tell the story necessarily unless you feel like it, but there was one particular poem I remember coming up in class, and that was, I've got it written down here, Casualty of War, in which there was an unanticipated sort of consequence, nothing unfortunate or anything like that or inappropriate, but there was something you had written in there that raised a sort of a surprising reaction in a couple of the readers. And of course, you as a writer have to come home and look at that again and react to that.
Yes.
And how do you deal with those things, when your audience raises questions that you hadn't anticipated yourself?
Well, that was one of the great things about the course, because mixing with, generally speaking, much younger people. And I'd written a draft of this poem about an aunt of mine. And I cannot, for the life of me, remember the detail now. But basically, I'd written a line which was implied a sort of stereotype view of women, and in which wasn't justified. And young woman in the group just went at me and just said, "You cannot say that." And I was completely taken aback and a bit miffed, because I thought I knew my aunt, you didn't. But I did go back and at home, and I realized what she was getting at, and I did rewrite that line. But it is a poem that I'm quite pleased with, because a number of poems are about people who I want remembered. I want to remember, and one of them was this aunt of mine, Mattie Rees, who I know Mag and Rachel out there will remember, and Gwyneth will remember Mattie. She was quite a character. It's called Casualty of War, and it's quite a deliberate title, because one of the things I've become very much aware of is the impact of the Second World War on our parents' generation. And it has a long legacy, and the people who were casualties of the war are not just by the obvious, by being wounded or indeed killed. So this is about my aunt Mattie, Casualty of War. In prosperous Carmarthen town, apprenticed to a milliner, she stretched felt, stitched feathers to the crown of hats she made for lawyers' wives, for the daughters of farmers to flaunt in chapel, tokens of their tidy lives. Pretty and with no care for the lovelorn men itching in surge, who waited and hoped in Knott Square as she passed on the arm of another. 1940 and redundancy. Carmarthen ladies had to improvise. Mattie's hats a luxury. So she worked in munitions, a canary, making cartridge cases for 303s. Scratched fingers, the stench of brass, and her hair bound up in a turban scarf. An affair with the manager did not last. The war over, her craft was outdated. No call for milliners in austerity Wales. And back in Knott Square, no lover waited.
Ah, yes, yes. I do remember that one, yeah, particularly. And I myself can't remember the line either.
Oh.
That was the bone of contention, really. I mean, I think,
Yes.
but it was. I just remember that particular instance was very interesting as I think as a class, and as we talked about, we got into the idea of accuracy of history versus the sensitivity to individuals, and it was really productive, because occasionally, probably more often than occasionally, things step on each other's toes, and we as writers have to reconcile them.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, that's never the easiest thing. I've got just one quick question, because I'd like, because time is getting on, it's gotten away from us a little bit, and I want to give you a chance to sort of feature your voice and read a few poems that you've prepared for us. But just very quickly, and hopefully somewhat lightly, what's next for Di the dog? Is he going to go into retirement with all the things that are happening in the world at the moment, or
well,
in our faces?
As an American, Al, you will remember back in the 70s that Henry Kissinger won the Nobel Peace Prize, and it was said at the time, that's it, satire is dead. Well, obviously it wasn't dead, but Di the dog is so completely overwhelmed by the sheer stupidity of certainly the Westminster government, the Johnson, Patel, Raab, the whole Cummings business. you couldn't write it. You couldn't write it. You would be told that it's just not. It couldn't happen like that. But it keeps on happening. So Di, when he's recovered from being completely overwhelmed by this, I think he'd probably want to sharpen his teeth and have a bit of a go again. But yes, and Di is quite interested in Welsh identity as well, and how we see ourselves and how we present ourselves as well, and how others see us.
And that's going to be an even bigger question, with the growing independence movement and things like that on the horizon. So, yeah. Well, good to hear him be back commenting on the whole thing. Yeah. As I said, thanks for putting up with me, but I want to turn everything over to Dave so that you can hear the real treat of the evening, some more of the poetry uninterrupted. So I'll step away for a bit, but thank you all for turning up. Hopefully it's been interesting, and hopefully we've covered some of the things that you've been interested in. But let's go and feature Dave now, and I'll enjoy some of the poetry from the collection.
Thank you very much, Alan. What I'll do is I'll read three or four short Di the Dog. Then I'll read one of the dancing poems, and then I'll end with a poem about my grandfather. So the Di the Dog, those of you who have looked at the book, he crops up, and there's some longer pieces, but Di started his life doing much shorter pieces, so I thought I'd read a few of those to give a flavour of his style. There is always a little introduction to these short verses. Sometimes the introduction is longer than the verse. Anyway, this is Di the Dog. Di's Republican sentiments are expressed in terms of dislike for some of his fellow Welsh canines. "I've never thought much of corgis," growled Di, "since I saw some on a TV screen, wagging their tails at Windsor and licking the hand of a queen." Di remarks on a surprising failure in the evolutionary process. Why hadn't the Welsh evolved with eyes in the nape of the neck? Di thought that would have happened. They're so fond of looking back. Di the Dog airs his knowledge of ancient Rome and makes what he hopes will be a salutary comparison. In the Roman Empire, the plebs, it is said, were kept in check with circuses and bread. The theory's the same now, I'm sure you realise. Only today we have the House of Windsor and a Big Mac with fries. And a last one. Reflecting on the ubiquitous poster, Di has clear advice on how best to help the heroes. Stop voting for the politicians who, without just cause, want us to fight old men's illegal wars. So that's Di. Al mentioned a couple of poems in here about men dancing, and this is written in the first person, Derek, but first person plural. It's a reminiscence of an event which happened to me in 1967, when I was hitchhiking around Europe, ostensibly on my way to India, but didn't get further than Turkey. So this occurred in a little village in Greece. It's called Dancing Lesson. We stopped at a village taverna, beyond tourist pretty Cavala. 4 of us on the hippie trail, with our wispy beards and smooth hands. Locals in their working clothes stood around the bar and stared, the way locals do. We got our beers and sat in a corner, the way strangers do. Someone fed the jukebox, and bouzouki music filled the air. One by one, the men began to dance, strong-armed, broad-chested, sure of themselves. They moved sideways with a dip of the knee, a slow, measured crossover step. Raised hands, snapped fingers, boots crashed down. Arms were hooked over shoulders, the steps quickened. From our corner we observed and smiled at men who danced together. The jangle of bouzouki sizzled through the bar. One of the dancers grabbed me, pulled me in. The others laughed, but they too had to join. We stumbled and tripped as our clumsy feet fumbled to a rhythm. There was laughter as our shoulders were clasped. We were caught up. We were joined in. We were dancers. And I'll finish off then with my favourite poem, Branny, Cultivation. I mentioned my grandfather earlier, and this does certainly, in my memory, represent how his day ended in the garden. Cultivation. And I got a little quote from Ophelia's speech. There's rosemary, that's for remembrance. After 50 years of digging coal, you saw the garden as a seam to tame with hard graft and rule, where yield would match your effort. You measured each plot to the inch, each row a cultivated reckoning. The soil nurtured, the crops rotated, sowing and planting, carefully considered, and your efforts bore fruit. It was not just the skill, but the hard ways too. You crunched snails under boot, hurled bricks at the neighbour's cats, beat the dog with a rake. You pegged finger and thumb on your nose and snorted out over the soil a swaying string of snot. You never wore gloves when working, so your hands were bruised and cut. You pierced a blackened thumbnail with a pin to release the gathering blood. The days shift over, blood and bruises darkened on your thin, loose skin. Then, at the garden gate, where the rosemary bush spread, your ritual. A fistful of the dark green, leathery leaves was squeezed. Then, the hand, a mask over your nose. Through the dirt, snot and blood, a whiff of incense, of oblation, and the memory of work well done. Well, thanks everyone. It's a very strange experience speaking into the void, but I hope those of you who are out there have enjoyed it, and thank you very much for joining in, and thanks to Al. It was like our conversations in the pub, Al, or went over a coffee, which was great. Thank you, and thanks again to Holly.